Hello, it's great to have you here at Edge 2023. This session is articulating your AI use case, communication strategies, excuse me, for regulators, auditors, and more. This session is a quick disclaimer that I'm presenting here on behalf of MindBridge, and these are my personal opinions, not representative of any committees that I may be on or represent. So I am Danielle Supkis-Cheek. I'm the Strategy VP and Industry Relations VP here at MindBridge. And I'm going to jump right in because we have a lot of content to cover today. So pretty much, why do we need to talk about this? What is an ensemble and what is an anomaly? Does different actually mean bad? How can you show that you can rely on the technology and the scope of procedures leveraging AI? So if you were just with me, you just saw this slide of why there's AI regulation coming and different technology regulations. The issue is now that we have to prove that we can rely on our technology, how do we actually do that? When you start to look at the data explosion that's created, when you run a test of 500 million rows and you run 32 tests on it simultaneously, you actually generate 16 billion data points. And even just to assess like one relationship of every transaction to every transaction for debit credit pairings, such as our rare flows, it takes 250 quadrillion relationships to assess that. So the concept of what is knowable and how to be able to know what you need to know as you're doing your different work is profoundly important. How can you rely that those 250 quadrillion relationships got assessed correctly? Was it designed correctly and was it executed as designed? And the reason we care about this is that AI is here because we need help curating information. We now are in a world of conceptual and curation, and that's what's going to be important. If we can't curate the amount of data that we have, we will miss something for sure because there's too much for us to assess. So how do we actually assess the data? We want to look for anomalies, and how we do that is through Ensemble AI. So a lot of people will use the term anomaly, I can't even say it now, anomaly and outlier. There we go. Synonymously. There we go. And truly, they're actually slightly different, but it's okay to still slightly conflate the terms because it's on a spectrum. The concept is an anomaly is the most extreme different. An outlier is just slightly different. It's that noisier stuff. And so what we're trying to look for, what is truly different than everything else. Now, you'll get to hear me in a second talk about different doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just means different. The complexity is when we run just one or two tests, like what you'd see on the right side to try to pattern out what is normal and abnormal. So let's say we run a couple rules-based or manual tests that we've assessed. It's a manual journal entry and over a certain dollar amount. We see a lot of clustering, but we also see a lot of other stuff that is interesting maybe, but we can't tell what is truly different because we haven't run enough tests to find out what is different on a multitude of different dimensions, just only a couple. So that's where the Ensemble AI concept comes in. The concept of an ensemble is to layer upon so many tests that you can truly find out how anomalous something is on that spectrum of outlier to anomaly. When you run all those different tests, it's computationally expensive. It is hard to do. It is not easy. It ends up creating a lot more data as well. So then you need a way to aggregate it back up to give you a strong individual signal. And that's why we end up having a high, medium, and low concept for our different risk score that then gives you a lot of contextualization about the individual components. And the whole concept of this is that anytime you have a poorly designed ensemble, it will outperform a perfectly designed one or two off test. The concept is you have so much duplication, triplication, design diversity, redundancy, that you'll find out what is truly different. And that makes for an overall better signal of what is different than if you just do a one-off test. And there are academic studies related to this, even one with University of Toronto and PwC. So once we know if something's rare and infrequent, we now have a bunch of stuff that is rare and infrequent. Hopefully not too much, but still some stuff. One of the things that I get a lot of is that thing I already knew about. It's boring. I don't find it interesting because I knew it was rare and infrequent. Well, good. I'm glad you found that because that's known to be rare and infrequent. It's known. I know it's rare and infrequent. That's typically your month-end close journal issues, that kind of stuff. Then you have your known unknowns, excuse me. And those are things that I know I can have something go wrong, but I don't know when it goes wrong. And then what people truly find interesting is the concept of the unknown, completely novel. I don't know. So is this all bad or is it good? So we all know, because we're all accountants or finance professionals, that there's a particular cadence to the financial reporting function or the financial operations of any particular business. This one looks like I have a quarterly cadence of all my transactions. I see these kind of humps and valleys. I see quarterly in this. I see a lot of spikes, but that's probably the weekly variations. Nothing on this makes me think it's weird. And I see a general trend upward, but still these quarterly humps. Makes sense to me. When I start to look at what is rare and infrequent, so the yellow lines are what is kind of more outlier, slightly different, but not completely very different than everything else, more outlier versus a full anomaly. I start to see about a dozen spikes. There's actually a dozen if you count them. That looks like a month-end close process to me. I know enough about accounting to know I have a lot of rare things that happen only once a month at the end of the month. That's rare and infrequent on those month-end close journal entries. They don't happen as often as, let's say, we're a retailer and we're selling whatever wares or goods, pairs of jeans. And every time I sell a pair of jeans, that is a high volume, low dollar, my month-end close journal entries are going to look very different than that. So when I start to see these, I have started to find some of my known knowns that are known to be rare and infrequent. And I don't think this is boring. I don't think this is bad. It's known. What I think people don't take credit for is that this is proof that your approach is working. Finding stuff you know to exist in the approach that you're trying to find, that kind of stuff, is proof. And as if whatever role you may serve, trying to say that this is boring is not the way to go with it. I think this is proof that our approach is working. And if we find nothing more, then we're in really good shape. But if we also find other stuff, this is how we know that this is the completeness of those things that are really, truly different than everything else. But that's not good enough. That's only one piece. That's only the top of the iceberg, if you can. We need to have a more foundational understanding to be able to rely upon technology. If you just heard my last session talking about technology outputs, this is relying upon just the output of the technology to provide evidence that your approach is working. And that's good, but it's probably not good enough in all situations. So how do you actually supervise the use of technology and then explain it to somebody else that is going to assess, did you appropriately rely on technology or not? So table stakes is always going to be confidentiality of data. These days, it is so important to have your data confidentially stored. We didn't talk about this in the last session, but watch out if you are subject to the international ethics requirements as a CPA or CA. There is a requirement to take an active step to reasonably protect confidential information. There's a reasonableness assessment related to that now, an appropriateness concept. So first, third-party assurance over the data. Then you have to make sure that the data is being processed correctly. For many of you in the past, when you're looking at something that is a control over financial reporting, you would go to a SOC 1 for this. So was it designed well and did it operate as designed? The problem is, and you just heard Holistic AI's CEO speak about this issue, is that it's never looking at the underlying algorithms in those kinds of engagements. So instead, you may have to tailor a specific engagement or a specific internal use case to go and specifically address the risks of the day that you're actually subject to. So in this case, for MindBridge specific, just because we'll happen to use that as the example, we need to make sure that the algorithms are designed well and operating as designed. So we hire Holistic AI to go through and make sure that we are at low risk for privacy, explainability, robustness, and bias to make sure that you can then rely upon the approaches of the algorithms. That's how you know, did rare flows actually work correctly? Now, the next level is additional optional testing that we have some companies like to do. And this is maybe what you would do if you did not have access to that middle layer. you can go through and recalculate a lot of different things. You can even do this on some non-glass box technologies as well. So what you do is you find a data set that you can actually work with, small enough to actually work with, you run it through the system, and then you compare your manual results. You look at the differences of what it's found. Now, you're not going to know every single thing about how those algorithms are designed when you do this piece by itself, standalone. So that means there might be variation between your results that you do manually and the results of your particular system. But understanding, okay, does that logically make sense why there's a difference? Maybe you plant some seed data or test data and see what it catches. That's the kind of stuff that you like to see when you, particularly if you don't have third-party assurance over the actual algorithms. This is very time intensive for some organizations. And if you're using a medium-sized data set, it can be actually pretty difficult to use a medium-sized data set in this regard. Okay. I have one question in, but I'll save that for a minute just because it's a good question. Now, as we move into, okay, we have a foundational understanding of the technology we're going to be using, and we feel comfortable with our foundational level of technology. Now it's going to be, what are we specifically, what task, use case, what are we using that technology for? And the appropriateness of the data going into it and that particular use case. So again, we're going kind of almost back to table stakes. You have to have complete data. If you're not looking at complete data, then any results that you look at are not going to be necessarily complete. You don't know. So you've heard a lot of other speakers talk about the completeness of data and having to assess the completeness of data to make sure you're relying on that full data set. And a lot of systems will offer you the ability to export, and you can compare totals or do validation checks to help you validate that the data is accurate. Now, here's where this last piece, the first example we talked about, where we're using the proof of the end results. So now the highest layer and the final, once we have this solid foundation of understanding the technology, and now we're looking at it for our specific use case. Does it make sense for the specific purpose? Is it meeting my expectations? Anybody that has a background in audit is probably really good at setting an expectation and seeing if their work meets their expectations. That's kind of, tried and true in the audit profession. And so why is it any different than technology? If I know I should have several series on a particular cadence of rare and infrequent series of transactions, or whatever may be the case, I know I have that one issue. Being able to find it and then say, this is how that system handled it, and it showed it the way I'd expect it to, is help that you're identifying that the use case that you're using is accurate and makes sense. That's that final step that I don't see a lot of people taking credit for, and instead tell me it's boring, rather than the true, almost assurance level gold of your approach is working. Now, what do people usually document for all this? Because, documentation is key for a lot of organizations. Is kind of almost, my presentation kind of flips to the other way. You start usually with an organizational centric documentation that pretty much documents all the work that you did at this bottom layer to make sure, yes, you can rely upon it. I typically see that at the centralized organizational level, especially if you're a CPA firm. There's a lot of requirements within ISQM or SQMS that actually require you to kind of validate that a technology can be used for a particular engagement or a particular series of engagements or use cases. So we see typically that. Then, depending on the use case, like if you're an internal auditor, a lot of times I will see some kind of additional scoping or explanation of the use of a particular tool and technology. This is how we use this tool. This is, here's our centralized documentation that permits it. That's not required on any particular engagement that I'm aware of, but I've seen organizations require that, and they usually put together a template so that it makes it very scalable and easy to implement, and in effect points everybody correctly to that organizational specific documentation. Then making sure that you're documenting that the data was complete. And then I typically see a lot of different system exports depending on whatever the particular use case may be. So if you're internal audit, taking a lot of tasks out of our audit task manager, I'll see the task level exports pretty frequently in the various work papers. And then a lot of different concepts related to annotations. So if you haven't used our annotation feature, it's a good way to get all your visualizations with comments about the visualizations exported in bulk. For any of my public auditors, one of the things that's really important to watch are the audit evidence projects. The US one is set. The international one is still being exposed, but it's in a very good state. One of the things to watch for is that they do have additional criteria related to making sure you remember to assess the completeness, but they also give you a lot more leeway to be able to have one thing that covers multiple areas. And that's going to be very important when you start going down these paths of centralized documentation that can then serve as the foundation for a multitude of different other areas within particular use cases or tasks that you may be completing. I just like to put this piece out there at all times that the FRC has a pretty good ADA refinement process. So just check out these links if you need some assistance here, because it's just a good resource slide for you. So how do we see the scoping of procedures leveraging AI? Usually what you have to do is pick out what procedures you're going to do in your particular use cases and then provide those. So one of the things that I typically see a lot of is external auditors starting with JECAT testing or JET testing. That's great. That makes a lot of sense. But it's not probably the highest and best use of MindBridge. It's not the biggest change that there is. And if you think about this session we just heard from RV Goldfarb on, it's probably a really quick point solution that gets us some efficiency, but it hasn't given us that full-blown system solution of transformative changes and efficiency. So I usually then see people go back and pick up some quick wins, particularly because the general ledger, if you're using the general ledger model, you've already validated the entirety of the ledger. And so what can you derive from a PBC population or planning analytics or quick searches, quick corroborating evidence concepts, and moving that forward. And then I usually see modifications to sampling theory, and we do have a Cherry Becker case study for you on sampling efficiencies and return on investment for sampling. Then I typically see a movement into risk assessment, and then even more innovative and advanced concepts on sampling, and then the pathway to substantive analytics assurance. For those of you that may be more on the enterprise side and commercial business, typically I see the first little, like, I don't know where to start. Let me go streamline my audit workflows. Whatever the auditors are asking me for, let me get those easily organized. Then I want to look at what the auditors are going to look at before the auditors look at it to mitigate and use it as my own findings. I can do some internal risk assessment with that information as well, just so I can plan out my work a little bit better, maybe as an internal audit scoping perspective, maybe even as a budgeting perspective. Where do I spend more time budgeting? But I think you start to find the transformative value once you start to make the move into our system solutions, which to me is taking credit for anomaly detection as a control itself. So if you're already going to go look at what the auditors typically find to be high risk, and you're going to do that as your own work inside of your own organization, internal audit, or within the controllership or CFO function, that's a control. That is a detective control. And so what can I work with to determine what detective controls can I put into my organization that serve as a pathway to be able to be more efficient to run my own operations? To me, this is what we call the pathway to AI CFR, so AI for internal controls over financial reporting. We have a couple other sessions at this conference to tell you a little bit more how to do this. But if you think about historically, most people find a problem that has happened, and then they create a preventative control to prevent it from ever happening again, which is great in theory, but that's very costly for an organization. If you think about what controls are meant to do, controls are actually meant to slow things down. They are meant to be that double check to make sure things don't go through that shouldn't go through. And your efficiency is directly opposed to controls. I'm not saying take out controls. We need controls. There's a point of having controls. It's to put those brakes on. But when we over pivot and put in too many preventative controls, particularly when we're a staffing shortage situation, we create a lot of organizational inefficiency. And in some cases, you're finding organizations that have to actually spend time figuring out how to almost bypass their own control environments just to be able to operate because they have their own staffing shortage situations. So learning how to put in early detection that looks at broad full population testing may be a more cost-efficient way for the organization to operate as whole from a transformative system-based solution, changing from the centralized steam engine where everything's centralized based on the power generation that RV just talked about versus completely redesigning your workflows. Okay, so one of the things that I see a lot of organizations doing is doing a lot of this work in different tools. And there are a lot of tools that can do and replicate a lot of these concepts very efficiently at smaller data sizes. One of the issues is that in the past, accounting data has been very batched. And that was because the computational power of most ERP systems, we didn't have big spreadsheet, like table-based software before in the 1400s. We had ledger paper and you had to total out your day and then batch it. Now that we have really robust ERP systems that can handle all the data in the first place, the data sizes, again, to go back to my initial comments, are getting profoundly large. And so when you try to look for anomalies in different tools that were not designed to use those versus taking the anomalies out and then using your tools that you're most comfortable with to then assess the overall structure or append other data sets to it, you're going to start running into theoretical limitations. So the ones that I typically see the most commonly used are ETL or visualization tools, your Power BIs, Tableaus of the world, and those do a great job of visualizing the data, but sometimes they're limited in their ability to compute and build together in those large data sets. They're great when you already have the batch data. When you're looking at financial statement level reporting data, those systems are amazing. I love them because I can get quick efficiency from the highest level looking downward into those. When you start with all the transactions and move your way upwards, they weren't originally designed for that and does make it difficult. So knowing I have about 3 minutes left, I do want to quickly answer a few questions that I've seen come in. I'll leave you on a page that you can download our slides and you can click on some badges that we have to help you understand this and learn a little bit more because I realize this is a short session. But has anyone been through an inspection or a peer review on engagement that use MindBridge? Yes, we have. Firms usually reach out if they have any questions when working with the regulators. I think there's also another question here. No. If you run into a question, you're welcome to contact me. We also have an industry relations regulator page on our website that you can reach out to or direct your regulators to if you're running into questions on those. How are they responding to advanced technologies like MindBridge? I mean, a regulator is never going to go down a path of endorsing that technology, obviously, but I will say most regulators are very open to having a conversation. Mainly because, particularly with me at least, we focus as an organization very heavily on transparency and making sure we're enabling our customers. And so that's a fairly easy conversation to have. If you look at a lot of the content that's coming out of a lot of regulators, they're saying, we need to be technology neutral in the standards. But when you look at the expectation of what needs to happen in a standard, the use of technology, I don't know how to do it without the use of a heavy technology and an advanced technology. So I would say the regulators are cautiously optimistic. They are expecting a certain amount of transparency and making sure that you're relying upon a technology appropriately and all the work about making sure you're relying upon the appropriate outputs exists. And then I have 1 more minute and I see I have one more. Is using holistic AI a requirement to prove assurance for software firms built on AI? Should we be asking vendors before talking to them? Again, holistic AI is another vendor. I don't think a regulator would ever be mandating the use of a specific vendor. That's just the one we happened to identify and pick because they were strong academics, and we started using them when they were at University College of London consulting, and then they've spun off. But the second part of the question of should you be asking to vendors of should you rely on the technology or have third-party assurance, I think you should ask your vendors, what are they doing to make sure that you can rely on their technology? I personally think it's incumbent on the vendors, us, to make sure that you feel comfortable relying on our tool. Now, our tool could always be misused. A staff could always misinterpret an end result, but you really want to see that our computations are well designed and operating as designed, similar to what you'd expect in a service providing organization under a SOC 1 report. So if that analogy helps, hopefully I answered that correctly. But no, I'm not aware of a specific requirement to use holistic AI anywhere. I know we're at time and I haven't seen anything else come in. So thank you so much for your time today. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.